Hello everyone. Alright, so let's move on to the next topic at hand, which is putting an input panel into our system. That way we can ask the player a question and they can input their own response in, and we can do something with that response. Like, let's go ahead and say maybe we want a character to ask for your name, at which point you're going to input your name. That name will be saved to the file that you're playing, and then that name can then be used in the tag manager and, just something like that. Just something that we'll be using character input for. So let's go ahead and get that started. We're going to need to design the input panel first. Now, I'm just going to make this very simple. I'm not going to use any other sort of purchased resources because I want this to be easy for everyone else to follow and something that we'll all have available. So let's just go into the root to our main canvas and into the layers, and let's figure out where we want to put this. First thing, let's go ahead and make a new UI panel, and we'll just call this input panel. So the input panel, I think I would like to rest between the controls and the foreground. That way it's above the very top layer of our visual novel, but it's still underneath the controls where the player can save and choose to load a file or enter the config menu at that point. So I'm going to place it right in between there. Now I'm also going to just make this invisible because when I have this input panel showing up, I still want it to have this image because I want it to be a raycast target. When our image is a raycast target, then that means anything behind it is not going to be able to be triggered. So we wouldn't be able to click the screen and try to advance to the next piece of dialogue. That's not going to work anyway when we implement a yield, as long as the input panel is open. But in case there are any things behind this layer, we want to make sure that we can't just go in and click those while we have the input panel active. So inside of the input panel, we need a couple things. We obviously need some sort of input field. So let's go ahead and use the input field that TextMesh Pro provides, because that one obviously has the nice text in there. Let's just scale that up a little bit and make sure it's centered in the screen, and that looks good. Now let's also go ahead and add in a TextMesh Pro for the title. Now this one's going to be positioned right above, at least in my case. I think I would have that as a decent position for this. And we'll just scale that a little bit, maybe change the font size, and I'm also going to center the text and just widen that up so that way it can expand out. Now I'll just make sure that overflow is enabled here, and wrapping we'll set to disabled. That way, if we go ahead and just make a long title, it's just going to overflow the edges, but it's not going to go downward unless we manually add a space in there, at which point I should probably have it centered in the middle right there as well. So we'll just make the default text title right now. And this text is going to be called the title text. And the input field will just be the input field. Now, as far as accepting the input, we could go ahead and make something that could monitor for the key press, such as the enter key, when we would just have to log that into our input manager. But I'm going to place in a button here that once I finish typing, I can just go ahead and click accept, and then it will accept the input. So I'm going to make a UI and a button from TextMesh Pro, and also move that down a little bit. And I'm going to scale it down just a little bit, and change the text so that way it's a little smaller. I'll change the text to say something like accept, and then maybe I'll scale it down horizontally a little bit. Just like that. And my button is going to, that seems a little small, but maybe I'll go and change that later. Okay, and that's our simple input panel. But now we need some logic to run this. We're going to need something to assign the title, and then accept the user input. And we're going to go into our core to do this, but we'll make a new folder because this input system is actually the start of a new type of resource inside of our visual novel, specifically for our dialogue lines, which is going to be a logical line. When we call for an input panel, it's going to be a special kind of line within our dialogue file that makes sure to open up the input panel and waits until that's completed before moving on to the next line in the dialogue. That is basically what a logical line does. So we're just going to start with that one, and then as we proceed through the next episodes, we'll make another logical line with our choices, and then further than that, making if statements available to us, or making random dialogue or conditional dialogue, things like that. So that's what logical lines will be. And our first one is going to be the input panel. So let's go ahead and make the input panel script. Okay, so for our input panel, we need access to the UI components so we can have our button, and to the TextMesh Pro component so we can use that input field. So let's make sure that we're using the Unity Engine.UI namespace and the using TM Pro namespace. And now we can go ahead and populate our variables. Actually, before that, let's remove update, because we don't need that. And let's just go ahead and add the things that we need. So we need something so that way we can reveal this and hide it. And that's not going to be as drastic as just enabling and disabling it, but soft so we can change that canvas group. There should be a canvas group that we can assign to this thing. I don't think I did one. We just have an image on there. So let's go ahead and add a canvas group as well. That way we can fade out the input screen. So real quick, let's go ahead and make a reference to that. So serialize for our private field as the canvas group, and this will just be our canvas group. And the next thing we need is the title text. So we can add TMP text and just call it our title text. The next thing we want to do is we want to get our button. So let's get our serialized field for the private button, and this will be the accept button. That way we can know what to do with our input panel, or input whatever you call it, input field. Could not think of that name. And speaking of that, that's our last variable. Let's add ourselves a reference to the TMP input field, and we'll just call that the input field. Okay, cool. Now for our input panel, we want to make sure that we can show and hide this thing whenever we want to. So we can make ourselves a public void called show, as well as a public void called hide. And the best way to handle the canvas group by changing that alpha value so we can fade it in or out is using the canvas group controller that we already made in a previous video. So we can go ahead and say private canvas group controller and just call that CG. Of course, this being the script that goes ahead and handles our canvas group for us. We'll go ahead and say that CG equals a new canvas group controller, and we'll specify this panel as the owner that will run the coroutine, and the canvas group it's going to affect is our canvas group variable from above. Now, let's also make sure that if we start our game that the canvas group.alpha equals 0. We want it to be invisible. Okay, and now there's another thing that we need to do. If we look at our canvas group component here, we have the alpha, and we have these two little booleans for interactable and blocks raycast. As long as interactable is on, then we can interact with these objects and input the text and accept it. But if it's off, then we can't interact with any of the UI elements underneath that canvas group. If we block raycast, then we can't click on anything behind the objects. So we want to make sure that these are on and checked when we're showing the panel, but disabled when we are not. And since we'll be calling that in start, show, and hide, let's make a little function down here, private void, called set canvas state, where we can assign those immediately. We'll just pass in a bool called active as to whether our state is active or not. And to disable this panel from being interactable, we can just say canvas group.interactable equals active. To block the raycasts, we'll say canvas group dot block raycasts equals active as well. And so in start, since we're setting it to be invisible, we'll go ahead and set the active canvas state to be false. Okay, awesome. So now when we go to show this input panel, we're going to want to make sure that our input panel becomes active, our input field rather becomes active, and also we want to assign something to our title text. So when we show the panel, let's go ahead and pass in something that will be our title. So string title. And we can go ahead and say that title text.text equals the title. And we want to make sure that our input field gets cleared out anytime that we restart it. So input field.text always wants to capitalize the ones that I don't want capitalized. But we're going to set the title to string.empty. That way, it's just an empty string. And now, since we have our canvas group controller, we can go ahead and tell it to set the alpha of this panel to be fully visible. So we can do that with cg.show. And now we also want to make sure that we are interactable and we are blocking the raycasts behind this panel. So we will set the canvas state from active to true. And if we are hiding, all we want to do is say cg.hide, and it will hide everything. In addition to also setting the canvas state active to false. Okay, great. Now, how about accepting the user input? What should we do when this button is clicked? Let's go ahead and make another void. Actually, this one will be public. We'll associate it to the button. Public void, and this will be on accept input. So what we're going to do when we accept the input is we need to make sure that it's first valid. So let's go ahead and check the input. If input field.text equals string.empty, maybe we haven't actually input anything. If that's the case, we're just going to return and do nothing. Otherwise, we need to go ahead and save the input to this panel. So we can go ahead and just make ourselves a string up above, something that can be publicly accessible so we can find out what the input was that the player provided, but it can only be assigned from here. So we'll make a public string called last input. We can retrieve it from anywhere, but we can only assign it from this script. And we will set that to string.empty for now, but when we accept the text, we'll go ahead and say that last input equals input field.text. And then we are going to call hide. So that way, after we accept it, we're just going to go ahead and hide the canvas. But that won't do us any good if we don't assign that to the button. So let's go ahead and do that in start. Let's go to our accept button and say on click, which is the event that will be called on this button when we click it. And we're going to add a listener to it. That listener is going to be on accept input. So whenever we click the button, we will go ahead and accept the input and close the panel. Great. Now, as for assigning this, I'm not going to actually put this on our input panel. Instead, I'm going to use that script as another manager. The reason being is I want to kind of eliminate as many scattered scripts as I can. If I just go throwing them in the hierarchy here, then I may start wondering where I placed certain things. But if I go ahead and set it in the managers here, then I'll always know where it is, and I'll just link it to the references inside of the layers. So I'm going to go input panel manager, and that will just hold the input panel script. So let's go ahead and assign the canvas group. Let's get the title text. Let's grab the accept button as well as the input field. There we go. Now to test this out, let's go ahead and make ourselves a testing script as well. And this script is just going to be, we'll make it input panel testing. So for testing this, I'm just linking in a reference to our input panel and then making Stella say something. Once she asks for our name, then we'll go ahead and open that panel. So we can say input panel dot show. So we can say input panel dot show, and we're going to show a title of what is your name? That's what we're going to be asking the player. And we'll need to yield until this is finished. In other words, until we have accepted input. For this, we can come to our input panel and just make a boolean called isWaitingOnUserInput that will tell us whether this panel is still waiting for the user to say something. And once we go ahead and show, then we're going to say isWaitingOnUserInput equals true, but when we go to hide, we'll say isWaitingOnUserInput equals false, and reset that. So then we can go ahead and take care of our testing. So after we show the question, what is your name, and we've revealed the panel, while we are still waiting on the user input, we're just going to yield and wait for it. But once we accept the input and close the panel, then Stella is going to say, it's nice to meet you. So we need to grab the value. Let's go ahead and say that string character name equals the input panel dot last input. And so then we can just go ahead and inject that in here. It's nice to meet you. Then character name. And let's just make sure we put that in our testing object, disable the other testing scripts, and then go ahead and assign the input panel. So let's go ahead and launch this. Stella says, hi, what's your name? Now we bring up the input field. It's a little bit hard to see. I might change, add a little bit of a background there. But if I click, I get nothing. Oh yes, because I forgot that my button to actually click is on the controls panel. So my input panel would have to be between the button and the panel in order for me to click that. Okay, so I will move that into controls over the button, which again is just for us clicking the screen to advance to the next dialogue. So I think what I'm going to do is I will make this a little bit dark and also increase the visibility of it slightly. Or I could add an outline to that text, but I think I'm just going to darken the background whenever the input panel comes up. So let's go ahead and save that. It's now between the button and the controls. So I might change this from controls to the player interaction layer. So now let's go ahead and do that again with it between the panel and the button. So Stella says, hi, what's your name? Then our input panel fades in. We got a little bit of a darker background, so it's easier to read the text now. And so I'll go ahead and type in my name and then hit accept. And now it's very nice to meet you, Avira. Okay, cool. Maybe I'll change one small thing and just have the accept button only visible when I have valid text inside of the box. So right off the bat in start, after we set the alpha to 0, set the canvas state to false, let me just go ahead and say that accept button.gameObject.setActive, we're going to set that to false. And let's add a little Boolean return function here called hasValidText, and this is just going to look at the input field and return a value if we actually have what we would consider valid text that can be accepted. So all this is going to be is we're just going to make sure that it's not empty. Return input field dot text is not equal to empty string. So that means that this is something that we would have to call once the text is changed in that input field. So maybe we'll go ahead and make a new public void called on input changed. And what this will do is it will say accept button.gameObject.setActive, and we're going to make sure that it is set to has valid text. So as long as we have valid text, then the accept button is going to be active. So let's go up to start once more. So whenever we change the text and type something or erase something in the bar, we want to reevaluate and make sure that the button is in the correct state. So we'll assign this to our input field. So input field has a little event called onValueChange. So anytime the text changes, let's go ahead and add a listener and make that onInputChange. Now we're getting an error here because by this event requires that whatever is assigned to it has a string so that way it can take in the value. But we're not going to use that, but we do need to just go ahead and provide it. That way we can assign it to our text. And so with that little change, if we go ahead and hop back into Unity, Stella will ask for our name, and we see what is your name, but we have no accept button until we start typing. And if we go ahead and erase everything, it goes away. Okay, so I'll put in my name, and then I will hit accept, and say it's very nice to meet you, Avira. Okay, so there we go. That is a simple way to add the input system or input panel into our visual novel. Now we just need to integrate that into our dialogue system. So we'll work on that in the next video. I'll see you guys then.